I don't have any pithy comment for you this morning, other than to say maybe the lesson is clearer than what we got outside right now. It's a pretty straightforward lesson this morning. I don't think that there'll be a whole lot of controversy, so we may actually wind up a little bit early today, right? So anybody want to fuss or complain about that? Not saying it's going to happen, but now's the time to object. All right. So continuing on in our conversation about Old Testament commandments that are repeated in the New Testament, we're going to look today at Exodus 20 and verse 16. I apologize for the noise here. I forgot my glasses. All right. So it says, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." And as always, we want to talk about what does that mean. So how about you guys tell me, what does it mean, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor? Don't lie about their actions, okay? Anybody else? Mark?
Basically perjury.
Perjury?
And under the old law, you had to have two witnesses to a crime. And if
Okay.
if those two witnesses made things up, then you were in trouble.
Well, we're going to talk about that a few times. We got a few examples of exactly that. So I think Keith and Mark both have hit on, without saying specifically, what this is. This is not, as it's often cast, a general prohibition against lying or to be truthful in general. This is about testimony, perjury, right, or actions as might be represented in a court or a legal proceeding or something of that nature, right? So we have to remember where this is at, right? It's in a list of commands that are the foundation for the civil law of the Jews, right? So this is really not so much about your personal integrity in your day-to-day life as it is in the maintenance of society, right? So before we go down that path, let's just back up a little bit and say that I'm not here telling you it's okay to lie, right? So let's have a look at John 8:44. It says, "You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, and he does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies." So here Jesus is telling the Pharisees, but all of us, that lying puts you in the camp with Satan. So certainly at odds with Jesus, with God. It's not Christian to lie. And then we look again at the end. It says in Revelations 21:8, I think probably all of us could quote this, at least in part. It says, "But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death." So, that's pretty much the end of any doubt, right? Lying leads to eternal death. Now, I'm going to ask you a question about that before we move back into the commandment. Why does it specify all liars? Why not just liars? Thoughts? We all lie. Okay, so we would be in trouble if we didn't have the grace of God, right? Others?
Because sometimes
I'm sorry, whoa.
right here. Sometimes we, as humans, determine that some lies are not as bad as others, so maybe I can get away with saying a little white lie, someone else a big lie. So all lies are lies in God's eyes.
Okay, so it's God helping us understand that there's no tolerance, right? That there isn't a scalability of sin, okay? I think I don't have the answer to this question. I just found it very curious and was mostly interested in what you guys might say. But I think those are pretty valid answers. Right, so moving back on to the commandment, why did God give us this commandment? Why was that put out there? As was touched on by Mark, I think this is about the integrity of the judicial process, right? There wasn't, at the time it was given, there wasn't like a state prosecutor or a court system, right? The accuser, right, was the prosecutor. And all of this process depended on the integrity. You didn't have professional judges, and there was no investigator that was going to create a discovery of facts, right? So it was all on the integrity of the individuals, and if there was no threat to their well-being, then, and we're going to see some examples of how this gets corrupted and how this judicial system gets abused, right? But if you look in Exodus 23, 6 through 9, I think we can kind of see what God's mindset was as he put this in. It says, you shall not pervert the justice due your poor you shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge and do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Right, so the orientation of this comment is against the powerful, right? In support of the weak or the disadvantaged. And it brings in bribery, right? So bribery kind of leads to a false witness. Might not necessarily be a direct accusational charge, well, I saw Bill do the thing, right? But it might be more suppression of evidence or things of that nature, right? But it's still creating a false impression of the facts, right? All right, so comments on that. Oh, I should also say, where was court held most of the time when we see stories about it in the Bible? Where did you take your grievances? Where is that?
To the priest, the Levite.
I was thinking the city gates, right? You're told that when Boaz redeems Ruth, right? That it's done at the city gate, right? So there's an official proceeding, and it happens amongst the men of the town, right? So again, it's not a real formal process. But coming back, anybody have comments on generally why? You think that's the correct reason? You have expansions? All right, well, let's look at some examples. The first one we'll call public corruption. And we'll find that one in 1 Kings 21, starting in verse 1. It says, now Naboth, the Jezreelite, had a vineyard in Jezreel, beside the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. And after this, Ahab said to Naboth, give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it's near my house, and I will give you a better vineyard for it. Or if it seems good to you, I will give you its value in money. But Naboth said to Ahab, the Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. And Ahab went into his house vexed and sullen because of what Naboth the Jezreelite had said to him. For he had said, I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers. And he lay down on his bed and turned away his face and would eat no food. But Jezebel his wife came to him and said to him, why is your spirit so vexed that you eat no food? And he said to her, because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and said to him, give me your vineyard for money, or else, if it please you, I will give you another vineyard for it. And he answered, I will not give you my vineyard. But Jezebel his wife said to him, do you now govern Israel? Arise and eat bread, and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal, and she sent the letters to the elders and the leaders who lived with Naboth in his city. And she wrote in the letters, proclaim a fast and set Naboth at the head of the people, and to set 2 worthless men opposite him, and let them bring a charge against him. So there's your 2 witnesses, right? Saying, you have cursed God and the king, then take him out and stone him to death. And the men of his city, the elders and the leaders who lived in his city, did as Jezebel had sent word to them, as it was written in the letters that she had sent to them. They proclaimed a fast and set Naboth at the head of the people, and the 2 worthless men came in and sat opposite him. And the worthless men brought a charge against Naboth in the presence of the people, saying, Naboth cursed God and the king. So they took him outside the city and stoned him to death with stones. Then they sent Jezebel, saying, Naboth has been stoned, he is dead. Right? So there's a lot going on in that. I mean, generally just begs the question, why didn't Naboth negotiate a lease or something whereby he didn't sell his inheritance, but the king would be allowed to use it? I don't know. But you see here the means by which this system gets thwarted, right? It's a setup. And ultimately, it costs Naboth his life, but there's surely repercussions to the people who went along with it, right? I mean, realizing that you're asking people to stand up against the king, and that's maybe a system that we don't fully understand. It seems like they should have known what God's will was and resisted that, right? All right, what do you guys think? Fog's got you all down, got you low. This is just the weather. It's very calming, right? All right. What's that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure there was some kind of reward paid to these guys, right? It's interesting to me that how this is set up. It says she sent it to the elders of his town, but it says the vineyard is right next to the palace, so it seems like it would also be their town. And it sort of indicates that these leaders are supposed to go out and find the scoundrels, right? So I don't know if Jezebel had some plants already in mind, and that was just not covered in the story for, to be succinct, but.
I think it's interesting that the 2 men alive are worthless.
Well, they were known to be worthless before. And we're going to see that when we come around to the New Testament as well. That same kind of, you have to ask, were they, she declared that she was looking for worthless men, right? In the New Testament, I think they just get labeled that, so that might be an after the fact. But then there's also, so that was sort of government corruption. You had leadership taking advantage of it. If we look in Genesis 39, we'll see more of a personal vendetta aspect of this, right? It says, now Joseph, 39, 1-4, and then 7-19. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had brought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph and became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he made him an overseer of the house and put him in charge of all that he had. 7. And after that time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by the garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled out and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought us among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. And as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, 'This is the way of your servant treated me,' his anger was kindled." So what's different about this, right? So we know that Joseph gets thrown in prison. But what's different here? There's only one witness, right? But why is that? Well, where are we? Well, but what legal system are we under? Egyptian legal system, right? So this is a Hebrew being prosecuted under a foreign system. So you don't have the two witnesses, but you still have this basic corruption of the truth, right? And she's very cunning, right? Like there's some implication that she dismissed everybody from the house so that there wouldn't necessarily be any witnesses. But one of the first things she does is she comes in and tells her story, right? So she kind of pollutes the jury pool, if you will, right? Thoughts on personal vendettas? Yes, Shirley. Gossip, right? So maybe not in a judicial, maybe it relates to us not so much in a judicial setting, but we can do the same reputational damage to somebody, right? So what would have happened to Joseph had God not been with him?
Probably stayed in prison.
What's that?
Probably would have been left in prison.
Possibly put to death, right? Prison may have been a diversion that God allowed to keep him alive, right? But he certainly would have languished. He would have had, he wouldn't have had the successes and the overcoming necessarily that we see. Other thoughts? There's another story in 1 Kings 22 about, I don't know how to say the name, Micaiah, but basically there's pressure put on this prophet to give a false testimony of what God is saying to Ahab. We're not going to read that one, but you can follow up on it on your own. Essentially, sort of what I said earlier about it would have been difficult for the elders of Naboth's town to resist the king, but here you have one of God's prophets resisting the king directly to his face. Right, so let's move over to the New Testament and look in Matthew 15:19. And this is where we find a restatement of this commandment in the New Testament. It says, "For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, and slander." And I mean, that's a pretty good rundown of the 10 commandments, right? It's not all of them, but it's a good chunk of them just restated right there in that one spot. And I think, Shirley, that kind of picks up what you were saying, where it brings in slander, right? All right, so let's look in Matthew 26, verse 57 starting. "Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, and where the scribes and the elders had gathered. And Peter was following him at a distance, and as a courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last, two came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent, and the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated on the right at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard this blasphemy. What is your judgment?" And they answered, "He deserves death." All right, so we see, we talk about the crucifixion a lot, and we talk about Peter being there and denial of Christ and all of those things. We don't really look into the kangaroo court that it was, right? The setup that it was. They were actively, it says, what we would now call suborning perjury. It says they were seeking false testimony. And it even says that there were a whole lot of people that came forward with false testimony, right? That kind of goes to what you were saying earlier, Keith. And I think what the implication is that it says that they were looking for it and a whole lot came, but only two. And I think what we see here is that there were a lot of people that came with just sort of crazy stories that the leadership knew, well, that's not going to play. We can't kill this guy on that. Maybe like I saw him turn my brother into a newt or some crazy thing like that. But these two guys come up with a pretty sound charge, because what they're talking about was a very public event, right? A lot of people would have witnessed it. It would have been talked about a lot. And it's interesting, what they say is a lot like the temptation of Eve, in that the twist, the falsehood, is a very subtle change to the wording, right? Let's look at John 2:15, and then we're going to jump down to 18 through 20. So this is the story of Jesus cleansing the temple. It says, "And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. So the Jews said to him, 'What sign do you show us for doing these things?' And Jesus answered them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' The Jews then said, 'It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?'" Now we of course know Jesus wasn't talking about the physical structure of the temple. He was talking about himself. The text goes on to make that clear, right? But what did Jesus say? Who did Jesus say would destroy the temple? He didn't say he would destroy the temple, did he? He said, destroy the temple, meaning you. He's implying they would destroy the temple, right? But when we come to these false witnesses, it says, this man said, "I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." So a very subtle shift, but it makes a big difference in the meaning, right? All right. Anybody have thoughts about that? Do we think these guys misremembered it? Or was it crafty?
It was a trial to get him. So since Jesus was in front of religious leaders, 71 religious leaders, it was intended to find blasphemous statements that he made so they could put him to death. So that's a blasphemous statement when he says, hey, he's going to do something that he seriously couldn't do. I think it was ushered in by God, really, though. But yes, I think they maliciously did it.
I would say they maliciously twisted it because of the way it's presented in the text. Mark?
Well, but be careful a little bit, because it says even later that even his disciples didn't realize until after he had been risen that that's what he was talking about, that he was talking about his body as opposed to the temple itself.
And I will give you that they didn't necessarily understand the substance of it. But what I'm talking about is the changing of the word, right? From who would, to imply that he specifically said he would destroy the temple. And I question, is that blasphemous even, right? To destroy the building, right? Maybe it is. I'm not sure, but at any rate, so he was convicted on that. And then we look again, another example would be in Acts 6, starting verse 8. It says, "And Stephen, full of grace and power, was doing great wonders and signs among the people. Then some of those who belonged to the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, and of the Cyrenians and of the Alexandrinians, and those from Cilicia and Asia, rose up and disputed with Stephen. But they could not withstand the wisdom and the spirit with which he was speaking. Then they secretly instigated men who said, 'We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God.' And they stirred up the people and the elders and the scribes, and they came upon him and seized him and brought him before the council. And they set up false witnesses who said, 'This man never ceases to speak words against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs that Moses delivered to us.' And gazing at him, all who sat in the council saw that his face was like the face of an angel." So what we see here, another element of suborning perjury, seeking people to say false things, but it's the same accusation that was made against Christ. Well, this guy is just repeating the story, so it's kind of like a secondary hit of the same thing. So I think, when you question, were these guys intentionally misrepresenting things? I think the lesson for us is to be very sure, if we're providing sort of eyewitness testimony, that we stick to the facts, that we don't embellish or fill in gaps, right? If there's something that we don't know for sure, well, don't talk, right? Yes, sir, Matt.
It's really interesting what you're teaching on. I guess I've seen some of this, but it's even more, I'm even more aware of it now as you talk about it. It's all around us. And we can give examples, but I don't think it's necessary. But we need to be very careful about how we propagate. Mm-hmm. There's a real risk that we, not even maliciously, but unaware, propagate lies.
Right.
And we're effectively then doing Satan's work. If we let's just say something really, to us, maybe benign, we hear something on TV, we believe it because we're intellectually lazy. And that's really important because we not necessarily have any evidence. We just assume that the source is correct.
Authoritative, yeah.
And then we potentially propagate that lie. We are actually doing wrong.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that you are an authoritative source to somebody, right? So you took that incorrect data at face value because of the source that it came from. You assume that source has done their due diligence, and you propagate it, as you say. Remember that somebody looks at you as a source of authority, right? So there's a reputational element for you as well in all of this. Right, so we have to ask, why did this come back up in the New Testament, right? We said originally in the Old Testament it was because we didn't have these judicial courts and we didn't have an official proceeding. There wasn't a judge, there wasn't a king. But here in the New Testament, we're under Roman law, right? So we don't need the law of Moses to be the theocracy. So why did that get repeated?
Well, they were under Roman law, but yet the Romans would allow Jews to have some jurisdiction over their own people.
Okay.
So in this particular case, Jesus was brought before the Sanhedrin. Stephen was before the leaders of the Jewish community there, so there was still some authority from the Jews over the Jewish people.
Okay. However,
When
the
it came
Jews
to
knew
fighting-
that they were secondary, right? And when you look at the trial of Jesus, you see the navigational politics that are involved to hold on to their authority but still get what they want by manipulating the Roman law, right? So I hear you, I understand you, but I kind of disagree with you. I think we'll look in a second here and see what's said, but I think maybe the reason for this is because false testimony undermines the law, right? It sets you're choosing to be above the law, right? If we look in James 4:11, it says, "Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks against his brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge." So don't think this is actually talking about Roman law. This is talking about a spiritual law, right? Sort of the golden rule, right? So then let's look ahead then to Romans 13, verses 1 to 2. It says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." So I'm going to propose to you that we can look at James 4 and Romans and say that God wants us to obey civil authority, and that lying or perjuring ourselves in court would then be breaking his law. So, do you guys think James 4:11 applies to court, or is it only a general statement about how we treat others?
So it could be both,
Could be both.
yeah.
I think you're right.
I mean, I think, if your overarching driver is how you treat others, then you're not gonna lie about them in court.
So, Mark said, if you're loving your neighbor or your brother, you're not going to lie about them in court. And then, of course, that's going to bring us to a conversation about neighbors, right? Yes, sir. A hand over way back in the back. Daniel, please speak up.
Yeah, so also there in Romans 13, drop down to verse 8. "Owe no man anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandment, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law."
Yes, and I bet we talk about that in a later class. So Daniel's pointing out that in Romans it says that basically loving your neighbor is the fulfillment of the whole law, right? If we look in Ephesians 4:25, it says, "Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another." And I find it interesting, if you look back at the original Old Testament commandment, right, who does it say that this is, applying to? Let me get back to my notes here. It says, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor," right? So I think there's a tenuous, perhaps, link from Ephesians back to the Old Testament commandment in Exodus. And then we see Jesus saying, and I think this supports what Mark was just saying, "Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil." That's Matthew 5:37, right? So when we're called to give some kind of testimony or some kind of report about others around us, right? And we know from the parable of the Good Samaritan that basically anybody that we can have contact with, Jesus considered our neighbor, right? So at large, we should speak the truth, nothing but the truth, right? And I think that's the swearing in court, right? That you will tell nothing but the truth, and the whole truth. Thoughts on that?
I think it all goes back to what you mentioned in Revelation 21, where he lists all attributes, and you ask the question, why don't he say all lies? Because if you look at that, men try to justify themselves, they can say, well, I'm not powerful, I'm not famous, I'm not tough, I'm not armed, I'm not sexually immoral, I don't believe in sorcery like dogs, I'm a pretty good person. But if you catch all lies, that is not a person in the world that is not lying.
It's that needle scratch across the record, right? Right, okay. You know, it's sad that that's in so many movies and the young people just have no relationship to that. Jim?
Going back to the Ephesians 4 passage, ridding yourselves of falsehood, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbor. That line is a reference to Zechariah. And just a couple of verses. These are the things which you should do. Speak the truth to one another. Judge, we're getting into legal terms, judge with truth and judgment for peace in your gates. Again, going back to that legal proceeding. And let none of you devise evil in your heart. And we read several passages where people devise evil against someone. Devise evil in your heart against one another. And do not love perjury. For all these things are what I hate, declares the Lord. You know, that thing of, putting, the government is put in place by God and do not lie, so that God expects us to be above board in our proceedings with the government. This is right here. All these things, the perjury, the devising evil, these are things that God hates.
Yes, and we talked last week about what people understand about us in the community and how that relates to God. So if we're doing the things that God hates, we're communicating to the people outside of the church that God's like that and he hates that, right? So it might draw his ire more than if we just were outside the church. Yeah. Okay, so this is a little bit from me, right? So, my opinion comes through in this question, but said, why would this commandment be de-emphasized in the New Testament, right? So we saw in the Old Testament, there's a direct command, don't bear false witness. In the New Testament, it's really just in a list of other things, right? So it looks to me as if it's not as prominent a conversation. Why would that be? Yes, Daniel.
In the New Testament, we address the heart of the issue. If you look at Philippians 2, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. So in the New Testament, we're addressing the heart of the matter that should hopefully stop this from even beginning to be talked about.
I think that's a great answer. Essentially, in the Old Testament, he's dealing with the law of the land. And in the New Testament, he's dealing with the law of your heart, right? And so it's less statutorily important because, as Daniel said, if you're doing right, then that's just going to follow through from right behavior, right? You wouldn't even consider to do that because it would be against your nature, right? Yes, sir.
Building on that very point and your point also, you read Matthew 15, I think it was 13, and it says, out of the heart comes all these things that were in the Old Testament, right? So just building on Daniel's point, what we read, this kind of comes full circle. That's what Jesus said himself. It's out of the heart come all these things from the Old Testament.
Right. Yeah, and that's in keeping with what we've said week after week after week is God's nature hasn't changed. The way that the law is implemented may have changed, but the underlying reasons still exist. Yes, Matt?
Paul says in Romans chapter 13, the commandment, you shall not commit adultery, shall not murder, shall not steal, shall not bear false witness, shall not covet. If there is any other commandment, all are summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So he's saying all of them can be in that one
Right.
commandment, in that new commandment. Jesus.
Absolutely. And again, that's flowing down from a heart of love, right, for your neighbor, right? And of course, that was a primary theme, or a big theme of Jesus's communication to us while he was here, right? Was that how we should interact with one another. Let's look in 1 Corinthians 6. And the reason I'm bringing this in is, in the old law, there was a expectation that there would be conflicts and that would be adjudicated through the sort of the elders of the community, the legal system that was there, right? And you could kind of expect that Jews would sue Jews, so there was this process. But Christians are discouraged from using the courts against other Christians, right? So, as relates to Christians, you shouldn't even be coming to the point where you would have an opportunity to bear false witness in court. You shouldn't be in court, right? So when one of you has a grievance against another, does he dare to go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? Do you not know that we are to judge angels? It's an interesting point. How much more, then, matters pertaining to this life? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is no one among you wise enough to settle a dispute between the brothers? But brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers. To have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? So, we're gonna wrap up here, but just suffice it to say that we've already hit on it. The prohibition against lying that we talked about at the opening of this conversation covers false testimony, right? The false testimony was a very specific case, but if you're not lying, you're not going to deliver false testimony. And anyway, I appreciate everybody's good comments, and we will wrap it up for the week. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week. Well, we got